Hello, good people of the internet. You currently find me halfway along the Great Ocean Road here in Victoria, and that's going to be for an upcoming article on the drivesection.com website. But right now, I'm driving in a rather sporty BMW X4 M40i. This is the second most performance-oriented version of the new X4. This one has a 3-litre straight 6 turbocharged engine, 285 kilowatts, 500 newton meters, 8-speed auto and all-wheel drive. So it's got all the right gear. And the reason I chose this car to take on this trip is because I've got a few friends with me. Say hi, guys.
Hi.
Now, I did have a choice of a couple of different cars when I reached out to BMW before I set off on this trip, and I decided on the X4 primarily for boot space. That was my main thing, and that's despite the fact that an X3 would actually have a much bigger boot. They didn't have one available though, unfortunately, but that's okay. There's only a 25-litre penalty in the boot, and we've managed to get all of our gear in perfectly. If you're heading away with 4 people just overnight, that sort of thing, it's the right size, I assure you that. Actually, you might have more space than we do because I've got a whole ton of camera gear back there, as does Georgia. She's got her own YouTube channel, The Departure Desk.
Like, follow, subscribe.
You're such a flog. Do the same to my channel as well, by the way. I don't normally say that, I just have it in written text at the end, but you know, that's okay. Anyway, the other reason I thought the X4, particularly the M40i, would be a good call is because if you're driving one of the most iconic roads in Australia, you do want something that's got the goods. Now, obviously, from all the specs I rattled off before, it sounds pretty impressive, but compared to the full hardcore X4M, I wasn't entirely sure if it would really feel the part of a proper M car. And I mean, when you put your foot into it though, sporty enough? I'd say so. Now, the other thing when I reached out to BMW is all the cars they recommended to me were actually SUVs. I'll admit, the car I was hoping to get my hands on was an Alpina B5 because I'd seen they had one of them on the press fleet. Wasn't available. Hopefully I'll get my hands on that at some point though and bring you guys a review of that. But it's kind of telling that all the cars they suggested for a Great Ocean Road trip were SUVs, because that's what most people go for these days. You know, the days of road tripping in a big old wagon seem to be gone, as are the days of sort of performance versions of normal cars. Because, I mean, yes, they still exist, but these are what people buy, performance SUVs. And that's kind of the niche that the X4 in particular capitalizes on, because it's got that coupe look to it. Now, obviously, there are some drawbacks with that. The headroom in the back is a little bit more limited, but are you guys comfortable enough back there? Yep. Well, it's all right. If you're like me, I'm about 6'2". It is a little bit tighter of a squeeze back there in the headroom department, but for most people, it'll be fine. Obviously, I mentioned the luggage thing as well, but not really an issue with 4 people. Maybe if we had a 5th person, it might be a little bit tighter in the boot, but that's okay. Now, one of the things with these sporty SUVs that I always kind of find, and this is especially amplified when you do have passengers, is the fact that being a lot taller, higher ground clearance and all of that than a sort of normal sedan or wagon or whatever, it does mean that there can be some extra body roll. Now, one thing with this X4, especially the M40i version, but even the normal like M Sport X4s, I did drive an M Sport diesel earlier in the year, the 20D, and I found they all have a fairly firm ride by SUV standards. But that does help through the corners a little bit because there's a bit less body roll. Tiny little bit of understeer right on the edge. That's kind of to be expected with most SUVs, especially being a lot heavier with front diff and all of that up there, along with the bigger straight six engine. A four-cylinder one would definitely handle a little bit tighter, but even then I'd rather have the extra power, in fairness. But that is one thing to consider, is the fact that you might make your passengers less car sick if you do have something normal, especially on a twisty bit of road like we're on right now. But are you guys all okay?
Yeah, all good.
Not entirely convinced, but okay.
Look, I'm feeling a little bit sick, but it's fine. I'm concentrating
See, I thought so.
on the road.
I'm only doing it for the camera, driving it a sporty fashion. But in saying that, for that one compromise of not having quite as tight handling, this does impress me quite a lot, the way that the X4 handles. For an SUV, it's pretty dialed in. You'd kind of hope so with an M car like this, even if it's not a full fat M car, but it does have enough of the right goods to put it in that same sort of echelon. I mean, it's got an M-tuned rear differential, it's got M brakes, which are a bit twitchy in the city, I will note that as well. Like driving around Melbourne, it was always sort of, they weren't ever getting up to temp enough, and when you come right to a stop, it would always sort of be a bit jarring. But once you're actually out on the open road with some corners and you can get a bit of temperature into them, they work fantastically. But yeah, I mean, overall, it's a pretty good thing to drive this X4, and it seems like it's fairly decent to be a passenger in as well.
Yeah.
The only thing for me is that, as popular as SUVs like this are for road trips, I mean, right now I'm sitting behind a Jeep and a RAV4, I don't feel like they really do anything that a normal sedan or wagon couldn't do. I mean, yes, you got a little bit of extra ground clearance, but given so many sedans and wagons these days, including a lot of BMW's own, do come with all-wheel drive, or at least BMW's performance variants do, you know, I'm not entirely convinced that you really need an SUV for this sort of thing. Yes, it comes in handy in some regards, but I mean, we're very firmly sticking to the road. With 21-inch wheels and low-profile P0 tyres especially, I'm not really going to be off-roading this thing too much. So far, so good. I'm pretty impressed with the way this X4 is going, but I will check back in with you when we get to our overnight halt and give you a final verdict there. Well, that was an ordeal, really long drive, around about 400 k's to get to where we are staying, just outside Port Campbell. Long drive, but a good one. I actually really enjoyed the way the X4 performed over this trip. It's been a really surprising car in that regard, because when I was driving it around Melbourne, I found, you know, with how firm the suspension was over certain bumps and how twitchy the brakes were at times, I might have had a few reservations, but I shouldn't have been too worried. It was really enjoyable driving this thing. It was pretty comfortable, certainly comfortable enough for the four of us. Yeah, there were a couple of bumps that I did feel over the course of the trip, but at the end of it, I'm not really feeling too uncomfortable. I am feeling tired, but that's because I've been running around getting all photos and video and all that sort of thing. So obviously that changes the story a little bit, but I feel like if I hadn't have been doing all of that, it would have been a very pleasant drive and I wouldn't be too tired at the end of it like I am right now. Now, I will say this car isn't exactly what you'd call cheap, about $110,000 starting price, but I feel like you're getting a lot, at least in the way of performance, for the money. It's a very strong performer. It pulls really nicely. This engine's nice and smooth too. I'm very impressed with it. And I'm surprised that I like how it looks so much as well. In silver, especially, I think that colour works for it. I was hoping for black, I must admit, but the silver has definitely grown on me. Just get anything other than like white. In white, this car doesn't look that great. But in something like silver, I think it's actually been fairly photogenic, surprisingly. So yeah, that's it. Great Ocean Road, BMW X4, fun times. Anyway, I'll see you in the next one. This will be slightly awkward, but
It's okay, no judgment. I want to see you do your
A little
thing.
judgment, but that's okay.
Don't judge.
I'm not
Savage.
judging, it's alright. That was a joke.
Okay,
I
Elena's
just
a
wanna
savage.
review
The lights are very cool.
The lights are
Yeah, that's my review.
Yes.
They're so.
So what do you guys
They're the
think?
highlight.
The
The
lights
lights
are
are really cool. Slides really
Pops out.
Just a little zoom in of me, like, ooh.
that's awesome. All right.
The seatbelt tightens when
Yes,
you
it
drive
does.
off. I'm
It's
like,
weird.
ooh. I want to see all the behind the scenes of this because it'll be funny.
There'll probably be a couple of outtakes, don't worry.
Yeah.